"Don't let that black boy touch anything." The words cracked across mission control so sharply that even the constant hum of computers seemed to hesitate. Every conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes turned toward the young man standing just beyond the secured glass doors, his temporary contractor badge hanging from a faded Navy lanyard that suddenly felt heavier than steel. Elijah Brooks didn't answer. At 20 years old, he had already learned that silence often survived longer than arguments. Outside the massive windows of NASA's Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, the early morning sky glowed with pale orange light as another launch day began. Engineers hurried through the hallways carrying tablets. Technicians checked final telemetry reports, and giant monitors streamed endless lines of flight data from Launch Complex 39B in Florida. Inside Mission Control, history was preparing to unfold, yet the only person being treated like he didn't belong was the one who had spent the last 72 hours trying to stop what he believed was about to happen. Richard Collins, the 60-year-old flight operations manager, folded his arms and stared directly at Elijah. His pressed white shirt looked flawless beneath the fluorescent lights, every crease as sharp as the confidence in his voice. "I don't care how many emails you sent," he said. "Your contract says software support. It doesn't say mission analysis." A few engineers exchanged awkward glances. Others pretended to keep working. No one stepped forward. Elijah adjusted the backpack resting on one shoulder. Inside it sat a weathered laptop covered with faded stickers from robotics competitions, open-source coding projects, and a tiny patch his late father had once worn while repairing navigation systems for the U.S. Air Force. "Sir," Elijah replied calmly, "the navigation correction sequence is going to drift after the second orbital adjustment." Richard gave a short laugh that carried farther than it should have. "You think 200 NASA engineers somehow missed something that a contractor barely old enough to rent a car figured out?" Several people chuckled, not loudly, just enough for Elijah to hear. "It's not about who found it," Elijah answered. "It's about fixing it before they're up there." Richard stepped closer. "Mission Control isn't a classroom, son." Elijah met his eyes without raising his voice. "Space doesn't care about job titles." That sentence lingered in the room for only a heartbeat before Richard turned toward security. "Escort him outside. Effective immediately, his badge no longer grants access to Mission Control." The security officer hesitated. He recognized Elijah. Everyone did. The quiet kid who stayed after shifts ended. The contractor who somehow solved software bugs before senior developers even finished reading the reports. The young man who always greeted custodians by name and brought coffee to overnight teams without expecting thanks. But orders were orders. "I'm sorry," the officer said softly. Elijah nodded before the man could finish. "I understand." He removed his badge himself and placed it carefully on the reception counter instead of forcing anyone else to take it away. As he turned toward the exit, one younger engineer looked down at the stack of printed reports Elijah had left behind the day before. Across the top of the first page, highlighted in yellow, were the words, "Predicted guidance oscillation during secondary burn." Nobody opened it. The automatic doors slid apart with a quiet hiss as Elijah stepped into the bright Texas morning. Heat already shimmered above the parking lot despite the early hour. A commercial jet crossed the sky thousands of feet overhead, leaving a thin white trail stretching across the blue. Elijah paused beside a bench outside, Building 30, and looked back through the towering glass walls. Inside, dozens of brilliant people prepared to guide astronauts millions of miles through space. He admired every one of them. That admiration had never disappeared, even when respect wasn't returned. His phone vibrated. It was his mother. "How did it go?" she asked gently after he answered. Elijah smiled, though no one could see it. "They don't need me today." There was a brief silence before she spoke again. "You still sound hopeful." Elijah looked toward the American flag waving above the entrance. "Because the math hasn't changed. And if nobody listens, then I pray I'm wrong." He ended the call, zipped his backpack, and started walking toward the employee parking lot. Behind him, hidden beyond layers of reinforced walls and glowing computer screens, the countdown continued without interruption. Hundreds of voices moved in practiced rhythm. Numbers rolled across enormous displays. Flight controllers confirmed systems one after another with calm precision. Everything appeared exactly as expected. Everything looked perfect. No one noticed the tiny line of telemetry that had just shifted by less than a single decimal place. No alarms sounded. No warning lights flashed. Only a nearly invisible change quietly slipped across one monitor before disappearing into thousands of new lines of data. Inside his backpack, Elijah's laptop remained powered on. The simulation he had written the night before was still running. A small digital timer reached 0. The predicted trajectory curved away from its safe path. Then the screen displayed one sentence in bright red letters. Estimated catastrophic guidance divergence in 47 minutes. The warning on Elijah Brooks's laptop did not surprise him. It only confirmed what he had been calculating for 3 sleepless nights. He lowered himself onto a weathered wooden bench outside. Building 30, opened the screen once more, and watched thousands of lines of simulated flight data flow across the display with quiet precision. The numbers behaved exactly as they had every time before. At precisely the same point in the mission timeline, a tiny synchronization delay between the guidance software and the reaction control system slowly multiplied until it became impossible to ignore. Most engineers would never notice it because each individual deviation looked harmless. Elijah knew better. His father had once told him that disasters rarely announce themselves with loud noises. They usually arrived disguised as tiny details everyone believed were too small to matter. That lesson had stayed with him long after his father passed away. Growing up in Houston's Third Ward, Elijah had never owned expensive computers or attended elite private schools. His mother, Angela Brooks, worked 12-hour shifts as a registered nurse at Ben Taub Hospital, often coming home exhausted but still asking about the science books spread across their small apartment. Every birthday, she found a way to buy him another used textbook from a second-hand bookstore. Every Christmas, she wrapped old engineering manuals as if they were priceless treasures. By the time he was 14, Elijah had taught himself 3 programming languages from library books. By 16, he was building orbital simulations on a refurbished desktop assembled from discarded computer parts donated by neighborhood repair shops. While other teenagers watched sports after school, Elijah spent evenings studying publicly available NASA technical papers, pausing every few pages to rewrite equations in his own notebook until he understood not only what they did, but why they worked. His favorite sentence had never come from a famous astronaut. It came from an anonymous systems engineer quoted in an old conference paper. Engineering rewards curiosity more than pride. Elijah believed those words with all his heart. That belief eventually earned him an internship through a community technology scholarship. Most people assumed he had been hired to organize software documentation or update spreadsheets. Very few knew that several debugging tools currently used inside Johnson Space Center had quietly originated from scripts Elijah wrote during overnight shifts. He never asked for recognition. Seeing problems disappear was enough. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Marcus Hill, another young contractor working in software integration. "Please tell me you are already home," Marcus said. Elijah smiled faintly. "Not yet." Marcus lowered his voice. "People are talking. Richard really canceled your building access." "He did what he thought was right," Marcus sighed. "No, he did what was easy." Elijah looked back toward Mission Control through the shimmering glass. "How is the launch room?" "Busy. Nobody has touched your report." Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment. "They will not need it if I made a mistake." Marcus hesitated. "And if you did not?" Before Elijah could answer, another notification appeared across his laptop. Live telemetry had become available. His simulation automatically compared predicted flight conditions with actual mission data. The deviation was already beginning, almost invisible, only a fraction of a degree outside nominal parameters. Elijah's fingers rested above the keyboard, but he refused to interfere. He no longer had access to internal systems. All he could do was observe. "Marcus," he asked quietly, "can you see the attitude stability graph?" "Yes, everything looks green." "Zoom in on the secondary guidance filter." Several seconds passed. "I cannot. My clearance is limited." Elijah nodded to himself. "I figured." Marcus sounded frustrated. "You really think something is wrong?" Elijah answered without hesitation. "I think something very small is becoming something very big." A warm breeze carried the distant sound of traffic from Interstate 45 as employees crossed the parking lot laughing over coffee, completely unaware that Elijah's laptop and the actual spacecraft were following nearly identical paths toward the same dangerous outcome. Inside Mission Control, dozens of experienced specialists continued calling out routine status updates with calm confidence, each confirmation reinforcing the belief that everything remained under control. Outside, Elijah quietly created one final document, simplifying his solution into 3 clear, corrective steps that any flight dynamics engineer could execute if they recognized the problem in time. He attached every equation, every simulation, every probability analysis, then saved the file without sending it. There was no address left that would read it. He leaned back against the bench and looked up at the wide Texas sky where the afternoon sun reflected off drifting white clouds. Somewhere far beyond that blue horizon, a crew trusted the people on the ground with their lives. Elijah whispered almost to himself, "Please let them prove me wrong." At that exact moment, nearly 200 miles above Earth, the spacecraft executed its scheduled correction burn. For 3 quiet seconds, everything appeared perfectly normal. Then one sensor delivered a reading that differed from Elijah's prediction by less than the width of a human hair. The onboard computer compensated exactly as it had been programmed to do. Unfortunately, that correction was the first step in the very chain of events Elijah had been trying to stop all along. The first warning appeared so quietly that nobody reacted. A tiny amber indicator blinked beside the spacecraft attitude monitor before disappearing, almost as quickly as it had arrived. Flight controllers continued reading their checklists with practiced confidence, while rows of massive displays washed the room in soft blue light. Richard Collins stood behind the guidance console with his hands folded, listening to status reports arrive one after another. Propulsion? Nominal. Power systems? Nominal. Communications? Nominal. Every answer reinforced the belief that the mission remained exactly where it should be. Then another engineer frowned at his screen. "Flight Director, I am seeing a slight oscillation in the attitude control loop." Richard barely looked over. "Expected after the correction burn." "It is a little larger than expected." Richard shook his head. "Keep monitoring." The room settled once again. Nobody noticed the young guidance specialist, Emily Carter, quietly opening archived telemetry from earlier in the morning. She compared the live data with previous missions and felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The numbers matched every historical profile until precisely 7 minutes earlier. After that point, the spacecraft had begun making microscopic corrections more frequently than normal. Each adjustment consumed only a tiny amount of propellant, almost impossible to notice by itself. Together, however, they formed a pattern. Emily walked toward Richard with her tablet. "Sir, I think we should review this trend." Richard glanced down for less than 2 seconds. "The software is compensating exactly as designed." "Yes, sir, but it is compensating more often than our models predicted." Richard sighed. "Every mission is different." Emily hesitated before speaking again. "Someone actually submitted a report about this yesterday." Richard's expression hardened. "The contractor?" She nodded carefully. His simulations described almost the same sequence. Richard looked around the room before answering, making sure several nearby engineers could hear him. One coincidence does not make someone a genius. Nobody challenged him. Years of experience carried enormous weight inside Mission Control. Richard had directed successful missions for nearly 3 decades. His decisions had guided astronauts safely through countless critical operations. Most people trusted his judgment without question. That trust had become part of the culture. Across the room, Senior Systems Engineer Daniel Foster leaned back in his chair and quietly muttered to another controller, "He probably guessed." The other engineer shrugged. "Even a broken clock gets it right twice a day." Emily heard both comments but remained silent. She returned to her console and watched the graph continue its slow climb. The spacecraft was still stable, still responding, still technically within acceptable limits. Yet every minute required slightly more fuel than the minute before. Above Earth, Commander Sarah Mitchell floated calmly inside the spacecraft, reviewing navigation updates while sunlight spilled through the small observation window. Beside her, pilot Daniel Alvarez adjusted a checklist before glancing toward another display. That correction felt a little stronger than expected. Sarah looked over. "I noticed it too." She pressed the communication switch. "Mission Control, this is Odyssey. We felt a slight increase during stabilization. Are you seeing anything unusual?" The reply came almost immediately. "Odyssey, this is Mission Control. We are monitoring a minor guidance adjustment. At this time, all systems remain within expected parameters." Sarah exchanged a brief glance with Daniel. "Copy that." Her voice remained calm. but both astronauts had flown enough training simulations to recognize the difference between ordinary corrections and persistent ones. Back in Houston, another alert quietly appeared. This time it remained on the screen. Fuel efficiency had dropped by less than 1%. Hardly anyone noticed except Emily. She immediately calculated the projected consumption curve. Her heartbeat quickened. "Flight director," Richard turned. "What now? If this trend continues for another 30 minutes, the reserve margin could become a concern." Richard walked over and studied the display longer than before. "Run another diagnostic." "Already running." "Then wait for the results." Emily lowered her voice. "Sir, maybe we should review Elijah Brooks's model." Richard stared at her without speaking. The room became strangely quiet. Finally, he answered, "Mission decisions are not made from contractor theories." Emily looked back at her monitor, disappointed but unwilling to argue further. At that exact moment, another controller raised his hand. "Flight director, guidance error just increased again." Richard stepped closer. "Magnitude?" "Small. Still inside operational limits." Richard nodded confidently. "See? The system corrected itself." But the controller did not sound convinced. "Yes, sir. It corrected itself again." The last word lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. One correction was routine. 2 could happen. 5 deserved attention. 12 began asking uncomfortable questions. As fresh telemetry streamed across the giant displays, the room slowly lost its earlier confidence. Conversations became shorter, smiles disappeared. Keyboards clicked faster. Somewhere deep inside the building, a printer quietly produced another copy of Elijah Brooks's forgotten report after an automated archive request matched its prediction against the newest flight data. The pages slid into the output tray untouched while, hundreds of miles above Earth, the spacecraft performed yet another automatic correction exactly as Elijah's simulation had predicted. The room changed one warning at a time. Nobody shouted. Nobody panicked. The confidence simply began to disappear, replaced by the steady rhythm of keyboards clicking faster than before. Emily Carter stared at the guidance display as another correction fired automatically. The spacecraft remained stable, but every adjustment demanded a little more propellant than the last. She quickly overlaid the current telemetry onto Elijah Brooks's archived simulation. Her face lost all color. The 2 curves almost perfectly matched. "Flight director," she called, her voice calm but unmistakably urgent. Richard Collins walked over again, this time without his earlier confidence. Emily turned the monitor toward him. "The divergence rate is accelerating." Richard studied the graph for several long seconds. "Run another verification." "I already ran 3. "Run a 4th. Emily swallowed. "Sir, the 4th one says exactly the same thing." Across the room, Daniel Foster removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes before pulling fresh telemetry onto his own screen. "Flight director," he said quietly, "I am seeing the same pattern now." Richard looked from one engineer to another. More monitors began displaying identical warnings. One controller raised a hand. "Fuel usage is increasing." Another voice followed. "Reaction control firings are becoming more frequent." A third engineer spoke without looking away from her display. "The onboard software is chasing its own corrections." The room that had once echoed with confident status calls now filled with cautious, measured voices. Nobody wanted to say the words everyone was beginning to think. Hundreds of miles above Earth, Commander Sarah Mitchell noticed another gentle vibration beneath her feet. She floated toward the navigation panel, while Daniel Alvarez monitored fuel reserves. "That is the 3rd correction in less than 5 minutes, Daniel said quietly. Sarah pressed the communication switch. "Mission Control, Odyssey, requesting clarification. We are observing repeated stabilization pulses." A brief pause followed before the answer arrived. "Odyssey, this is Mission Control. We are reviewing guidance data. Continue current procedures." Sarah looked toward the small window where Earth drifted silently beneath them. "Copy, we will hold." She muted the microphone before speaking to Daniel. "That answer sounded different." Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, they are worried." Back in Houston, Richard finally picked up the printed report that had been sitting untouched on a nearby console. The cover page read exactly as he remembered. "Predicted guidance oscillation during secondary burn." Written by Elijah Brooks. He flipped through the pages faster with every equation, every chart, every projected timeline, every warning. Emily watched him carefully. "Sir?" Richard did not answer immediately. He reached the final page and found a highlighted sentence near the bottom. "If corrective synchronization is not manually recalibrated before cumulative drift exceeds threshold, Automated stabilization will consume reserve propellant exponentially while reinforcing the original navigation error. Richard slowly lowered the report. The room felt unusually cold despite the constant hum of electronics. Daniel Foster looked toward him. How much reserve do we lose if that model is correct? Emily typed rapidly. The result appeared almost instantly. She read it twice before speaking. Enough to prevent a safe return trajectory. Nobody moved. Richard finally broke the silence. Can our current software patch the guidance filter? Daniel answered first. Not without rewriting the synchronization logic. Another engineer added. That would normally take weeks of validation. Richard looked around the room. We do not have weeks. Emily quietly reached for another page inside Elijah's report. Actually, he already wrote an adaptive synchronization algorithm. Richard looked up sharply. What? It is here. She pointed toward the appendix. He included executable logic with simulation results. Daniel leaned closer. Has anyone tested it? Emily hesitated. Only him. Richard closed the report. We cannot upload unverified software into a live spacecraft. Emily met his eyes. Sir, we are already flying toward an unverified outcome. The words settled heavily over the room. Nobody argued. Another alarm chimed. Fuel projections dropped again. Commander Sarah Mitchell's voice returned through the speakers, still calm but carrying a subtle edge. Mission Control, Odyssey. We are observing additional guidance activity. We request updated assessment. Richard stepped toward the microphone himself. Odyssey, we are analyzing the situation. Please stand by. Sarah answered after a brief pause. Understood. We trust you. The transmission ended, leaving only the soft hiss of static. Richard stared at the silent speaker for several moments before looking back at Elijah's report resting in his hands. The young contractor he had removed from Mission Control only hours earlier had predicted every stage of the anomaly with unsettling precision. Outside the building, the afternoon sun slowly drifted west over Houston while Elijah sat alone beneath the shade of a live oak tree several blocks away, completely unaware that inside Building 30, the same people who had dismissed his warnings were now reading every line he had written as though the future depended on it. Because for 3 astronauts quietly circling above the Earth, it suddenly did. Richard Collins slowly placed Elijah Brooks's report on the console, as if the weight of the paper had suddenly become impossible to ignore. For the first time that morning, nobody in Mission Control looked toward him for reassurance. Instead, every engineer focused on their own screens, silently searching for an answer that refused to appear. The giant countdown clocks no longer felt like symbols of progress. They felt like reminders that every passing second narrowed the astronauts' chances of returning home safely. Emily Carter leaned toward her workstation as another simulation completed. The result was identical to the previous 4. She took a slow breath before speaking. Flight Director, our correction models are failing. Richard looked up. Run the backup navigation package. Daniel Foster was already shaking his head. It cannot compensate fast enough. Then isolate the synchronization loop. We tried. Reduce the correction frequency. That only delays the instability. Another engineer spoke from the propulsion console. Fuel reserves have dropped below our planned recovery margin. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment before opening them again. How much time do we have before the trajectory becomes unrecoverable? Nobody answered immediately. Emily typed one final command and watched the projection finish calculating. The room seemed to grow quieter with every percentage point appearing across her screen. Finally, she swallowed and answered. 41 minutes before we lose the window for an efficient recovery solution. The words settled over Mission Control like heavy fog. Across the room, nobody reached for another cup of coffee. Nobody made another joke. The confidence that had filled the building only an hour earlier had completely disappeared. Above the Earth, Commander Sarah Mitchell floated beside the navigation display, carefully reviewing the latest fuel readings. Daniel Alvarez looked toward her with quiet concern. We are burning more propellant than the flight plan allows. Sarah nodded. Mission Control knows. Daniel managed a faint smile. I hope they know why, Sarah answered softly. They always have before. Back in Houston, Richard turned toward the systems team. I want every available specialist in this room. Within minutes, additional engineers hurried into Mission Control carrying laptops and technical manuals. Some had been pulled from neighboring departments. Others joined remotely through secure conference links from Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama and Kennedy Space Center in Florida. The brightest minds available immediately began reviewing telemetry, software logs, and propulsion data. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Equations covered digital whiteboard. Simulations launched one after another. Every proposed solution ended the same way. Temporary improvement followed by even greater instability. Daniel finally pushed his chair back in frustration. Nothing holds. Emily quietly added, "Every correction feeds the next error." Another senior engineer looked toward Richard. "The onboard software is fighting itself." Richard stared at the rows of monitors glowing across the room. For the first time in his long career, he could not find an order that would solve the problem. His experience had always carried him through uncertainty. Today, experience alone was not enough. Emily carefully picked up Elijah's report once more. "Sir," Richard did not respond. "You asked us to find a solution." He slowly turned toward her. She placed the report on the conference table where everyone could see it. "We already have one." Several engineers exchanged uneasy glances. Daniel spoke first. "She is right." Another controller nodded reluctantly. "His predicted timeline matches our live telemetry almost perfectly." Richard looked around the room. "You are asking me to trust software written by someone who has never served as a certified flight dynamics engineer?" Emily answered without hesitation. "No, sir." Richard frowned. "Then what are you asking?" Emily held his gaze. "I am asking you to trust the mathematics." Silence followed. Richard remembered the young man standing outside the security doors only hours earlier. He remembered dismissing him before reading a single page of the report now lying open in front of him. He remembered the sentence that still echoed in his mind. Space does not care about job titles. The irony felt almost unbearable. Another alarm sounded. This one remained active. Fuel reserve projections dropped again. Commander Sarah Mitchell's calm voice returned through the communications system. "Mission Control. Odyssey requesting updated guidance. We are observing increased stabilization events and would appreciate your assessment." Richard reached for the microphone but paused before pressing the transmit button. For several seconds, he simply stood there, listening to the soft static filling the room. Finally, he answered, "Odyssey, we are working every available option. Please continue conserving onboard resources while we finalize our recommendation." Sarah responded with complete professionalism. "Understood, Flight Director. We believe in you." The transmission ended, but those 4 words remained in the room long after the speaker fell silent. "We believe in you." Richard lowered the microphone slowly. Then he looked toward Emily. "Where is Elijah Brooks?" Emily hesitated. "Security removed his building access." "That is not what I asked." Daniel immediately opened the personnel database. "His emergency contact is his mother." Richard shook his head. "Call his phone first." Daniel entered the number. Everyone in Mission Control watched the speaker as the call connected. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. No one said a word. The room that had once told a young black contractor not to touch anything was now holding its breath, hoping that he would answer. The 4th ring echoed through the speaker before the call finally connected. For a brief second, nobody spoke. The entire Mission Control room stood frozen beneath the glow of dozens of giant displays, listening to nothing except the faint sound of breathing on the other end of the line. "Hello?" Elijah Brooks answered calmly. Daniel Foster looked toward Richard Collins before pressing the microphone button. "Elijah, this is Daniel from Mission Control." A short silence followed. "I know your voice," Elijah replied. "Is everyone all right?" Daniel glanced toward Richard, who slowly stepped forward. The room watched in complete silence as the flight director reached for the microphone himself. His confident posture from earlier that morning had vanished. "Elijah," Richard said quietly, "this is Richard Collins." Another pause. Outside, a warm Gulf Coast breeze rustled the leaves around the bench where Elijah still sat with his laptop resting across his knees. Cars passed along NASA Parkway, completely unaware that one phone conversation was about to change the course of an entire mission. "Yes, sir," Elijah answered with the same respectful tone he had used before being escorted out. Richard swallowed before speaking again. "We reviewed your report." Elijah did not interrupt. "Your predictions were accurate." The words seemed almost difficult for Richard to say. Around him, every engineer kept their eyes fixed on the floor or their screens. Nobody wanted to break the silence. Elijah slowly closed his laptop. "How much time do they have?" Richard looked toward Emily Carter. She quietly read the newest projection. 33 minutes before the recovery window closes." Elijah nodded almost to himself. "The synchronization loop has entered positive feedback." Emily's eyes widened. How did you know without seeing the telemetry? Elijah gave a small smile that nobody inside Mission Control could see. Because if the first 4 stages matched my model, the 5th one always follows. Daniel leaned closer to the speaker. Can your algorithm still stop it? Elijah answered without hesitation. Yes. Several engineers released quiet breaths they did not realize they had been holding. Richard asked carefully, Can you explain it over the phone? Elijah looked toward the bright Texas sky where a commercial airplane crossed high above the clouds. Not safely. Richard frowned. Why not? Because the adaptive synchronization has to be calibrated in real time while watching multiple telemetry streams together. One incorrect variable and the spacecraft will waste even more fuel. Nobody questioned him. Emily already understood exactly what he meant. She turned toward Richard. He has to be here. Richard remained silent for several long seconds. The words he had spoken that morning echoed relentlessly inside his own mind. You will never step inside Mission Control again. He slowly lowered his head before speaking into the microphone. Elijah. Yes, sir? I was wrong. The room became so quiet that the soft hum of the cooling system sounded almost deafening. Richard continued. I judged your position instead of your work. I dismissed your warning before I understood it. 3 astronauts are depending on us now, and I am asking you to come back. Elijah did not answer immediately. He remembered the laughter. He remembered the security doors closing. He remembered hearing someone say that a black contractor should not touch anything inside Mission Control. Yet none of those memories outweighed the faces of the astronauts whose photographs had appeared on the mission briefing screen only hours earlier. Commander Sarah Mitchell, Pilot Daniel Alvarez, Mission Specialist Hannah Reed. They had trusted the people on the ground with their lives. Elijah took one slow breath. This has never been about proving anyone wrong. Richard closed his eyes. I know. It has always been about bringing them home. Emily quietly wiped away a tear before anyone noticed. Daniel immediately stood up. I am sending a security vehicle now. Elijah shook his head even though they could not see him. That will take too long. He slipped his laptop into his backpack and stood from the bench. I am only a few blocks away. I can run. Richard looked toward the large mission clock counting steadily downward. We will have the front gate open. Elijah adjusted the straps on his backpack. Please have guidance, propulsion, navigation, and software integration waiting together. Emily answered instantly. Already done. And do not upload anything until I verify the live telemetry myself. Understood. The call ended. For several seconds, nobody inside Mission Control moved. Then the room suddenly came alive. Engineers hurried between consoles carrying tablets. Large displays shifted from monitoring mode into emergency analysis. Security personnel rushed toward the main entrance. Richard quietly picked up the contractor badge Elijah had placed on the reception counter hours earlier. He held it in his hand for a long moment before walking toward the front doors himself. Outside, beneath the brilliant afternoon sun of Houston, a young black engineer began running toward the very building that had rejected him only hours before, carrying nothing except a worn backpack, an old laptop, and the solution that every expert inside was now praying would be enough. The glass doors slid open before Elijah Brooks reached them. 2 security officers stepped aside without saying a word, their expressions completely different from the ones they had worn only hours earlier. Richard Collins stood waiting just inside the entrance, the temporary contractor badge resting quietly in his hand. As Elijah slowed to catch his breath, Richard extended the badge toward him. I should never have taken this away, he said softly. Elijah accepted it without triumph or hesitation. We can talk later, he replied. Right now they need us. Richard nodded once. This way. The long hallway leading toward Mission Control felt strangely different than it had that morning. Engineers who had laughed or looked away now stepped aside in respectful silence as Elijah hurried past with his backpack over one shoulder. Nobody whispered. Nobody questioned why he had returned. Every face carried the same expression. Hope mixed with urgency. The enormous digital mission clock continued counting down above the entrance. 28 minutes remained before the recovery window closed. As the doors to Mission Control opened, every conversation stopped. More than 50 engineers turned toward the young man walking into the room. Elijah did not acknowledge the attention. His eyes went directly to the main telemetry display stretching across the front wall. Project the live guidance synchronization matrix, he said calmly while placing his laptop beside the primary navigation console. Emily Carter immediately began typing. Already on screen. Elijah looked for less than 5 seconds before speaking again. Bring up reaction control timing, fuel consumption history, inertial measurement alignment, and Star Tracker confidence values. Daniel Foster quickly added the requested data. 4 additional windows appeared across the giant display. Elijah stepped closer. His eyes moved rapidly from one graph to another. The room remained completely silent except for the steady clicking of keyboards. Finally, Elijah pointed toward a small section of the telemetry. There, several engineers leaned forward. Richard frowned. I do not see anything unusual. Elijah nodded. That is because you are looking at the correction. He traced another line with his finger. You need to look at what happens exactly 1.8 seconds before every correction. Emily zoomed in. The tiny fluctuation became visible. Her eyes widened. The synchronization clock is drifting before the software responds. Elijah smiled gently. Exactly. Daniel stared at the screen. We kept treating the correction as the problem. It is not, Elijah replied. The correction is only trying to save the spacecraft from the real problem. Richard folded his arms, listening carefully. Can the adaptive algorithm still stabilize it? Elijah opened his laptop. Yes, but we cannot replace the existing software. Several engineers looked confused. Richard asked, why not? Because replacing it would restart the navigation cycle. Elijah connected his computer to the analysis network. Instead, we let the existing system continue running while my algorithm quietly changes how it interprets the synchronization timing. Emily immediately understood. You are teaching the software instead of replacing it. Elijah nodded. Exactly. The room suddenly filled with focused activity. Emily, compare my predicted drift curve against live telemetry every 5 seconds. Already running. Daniel, prepare an uplink package, but do not transmit until I verify the checksum. Understood. Propulsion. I need exact reserve numbers. Current usable reserve is 64%. Elijah entered several commands before another graph appeared across the display. The projected trajectory slowly bent back toward the safe return corridor. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Richard stepped closer. Is that real? Elijah answered without looking up. Only if the live telemetry agrees. Above the Earth, Commander Sarah Mitchell watched another stabilization pulse ripple gently through the spacecraft. She pressed the communications switch. Mission Control, Odyssey. We are continuing to observe repeated guidance adjustments. Emily looked toward Elijah. He gave a small nod. Richard activated the microphone. Odyssey, this is Flight Director. We have identified the source of the anomaly and are preparing a navigation refinement. Sarah's voice remained calm. Copy that, Flight Director. Daniel Alvarez smiled faintly from beside the navigation panel. That sounds much better than before. Sarah quietly replied, Yes. Someone found the answer. Back in Houston, Elijah stared at one final equation on his screen. His fingers hovered above the keyboard before he stopped. Wait. Every engineer froze. Richard looked toward him. What is it? Elijah leaned closer to the telemetry display. The onboard clock drift is increasing faster than my original model predicted. Emily immediately recalculated the numbers. You are right. Richard felt his heartbeat quicken. Can the algorithm still work? Elijah remained silent for several long seconds. Then he reached into his backpack and removed a worn notebook filled with handwritten equations dating back several years. He quickly flipped through page after page until stopping near the middle. A small smile appeared across his face. I forgot. Richard looked confused. Forgot what? Elijah pointed toward an older equation written neatly in blue ink. I solved this problem 2 years ago. Without another word, he began rewriting the adaptive algorithm directly into the live mission package, while every engineer inside Mission Control watched the young man they had once dismissed quietly reshape the fate of an entire space mission one line of mathematics at a time. Elijah Brooks rested both hands on the keyboard for one final second before pressing the confirmation key. The modified synchronization package immediately began running through NASA's validation system. Every engineer inside Mission Control watched the progress bar inch forward across the enormous display without saying a single word. 23 minutes remained. Nobody breathed easily. Nobody looked away. Emily Carter quietly monitored every checksum as lines of verification scrolled across her screen. Integrity check complete, she announced. No data corruption detected. Daniel Foster compared the uploaded package against the spacecraft's software. Compatibility confirmed. Richard Collins looked toward Elijah. Are you ready? Elijah kept his eyes on the live telemetry. Not yet. Richard frowned. What are we waiting for? Elijah pointed toward the reaction control timeline. The spacecraft has to reach the next stabilization cycle. If we transmit now, Both synchronization systems will compete with each other. Emily immediately understood. He is right. The room returned to silence. Every second felt heavier than the one before it. Above the earth, Commander Sarah Mitchell floated beside the command panel, while Daniel Alvarez quietly reviewed fuel consumption. Mission Specialist Hannah Reed looked through the observation window as sunlight reflected brilliantly across the curve of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles below. "Hard to believe the whole world looks so peaceful from up here," she whispered. Sarah smiled gently. "Sometimes the hardest work happens where nobody can see it." A tone sounded softly inside the cabin. Mission Control's communication channel opened once again. Richard pressed the microphone. "Odyssey, this is Flight Director. We have developed a corrective guidance refinement. We will transmit updated synchronization parameters shortly." Sarah answered immediately. "Copy that, Flight Director. Crew standing by." Elijah quietly counted the seconds while watching the onboard timing sequence approach the precise point he had predicted years earlier during one of his late-night simulations. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the console. "Now," Daniel transmitted the package without hesitation. Across every display inside Mission Control, new data streamed toward the spacecraft through NASA's Deep Space Network. Nobody spoke while the upload progressed. 8%, 22%, 47%, 74%, 100%. Emily immediately searched the telemetry. Software accepted. Daniel leaned closer, waiting for execution. The room stood perfectly still, hundreds of miles above Earth. Sarah watched the navigation display flicker once before stabilizing. Daniel Alvarez studied the reaction control indicators. Synchronization update received. Sarah nodded. Executing. She pressed the confirmation switch. For one long moment, nothing appeared to happen. Then the familiar stabilization pulse arrived. Only this time it lasted less than half as long. Hannah looked toward the fuel monitor. Propellant consumption just dropped. Daniel's eyes widened. By almost 40%. Sarah immediately contacted Houston. "Mission Control, Odyssey. We are observing reduced stabilization activity." Emily watched the incoming telemetry race across her screen. A smile slowly spread across her face. "Flight Director." Richard looked toward her. "The drift is slowing," Daniel added excitedly. "The synchronization clocks are realigning." Another engineer called out from the propulsion console. "Fuel projections are recovering." One by one, the warning indicators that had filled the displays throughout the afternoon quietly disappeared. Amber became green, red became blue. Numbers that had climbed relentlessly toward disaster gradually settled back inside safe operating limits. Nobody cheered. Not yet. Elijah continued studying every graph with complete concentration. "We still have one more cycle," Richard asked softly. "Could it fail again?" Elijah answered honestly. "If my assumptions were wrong, yes." Another minute passed. The spacecraft reached the next automatic guidance event. Every engineer watched the telemetry as though the future itself depended on the next few seconds. Commander Sarah Mitchell rested one hand lightly against the control panel while Daniel counted under his breath. 3, 2, 1. The stabilization sequence activated. This time, the spacecraft corrected its orientation with one smooth adjustment. No oscillation followed. No unnecessary correction appeared afterward. Fuel usage remained steady. Sarah looked toward Daniel with a smile that neither of them had expected to share that day. "Mission Control," she said warmly. "Odyssey confirms nominal guidance. Repeat, nominal guidance." Inside Building 30, nobody moved for several heartbeats. Then Emily quietly laughed through tears she had been holding back for nearly an hour. Daniel leaned back in his chair and covered his face with both hands before looking toward Elijah with complete disbelief. Richard Collins remained standing silently beside the young engineer. He stared at the stable trajectory now glowing across the enormous front display before turning slowly toward Elijah. "You brought them back," he said quietly. Elijah never looked away from the telemetry. He simply shook his head with a gentle smile. "Not me," Richard frowned. Elijah glanced around the room at every engineer who had spent the last hour refusing to give up. "All of us," he answered. "Space has never cared who gets the credit. It only asks whether we are willing to work together to bring people home." The room fell silent once more, but this time it was not the silence of fear or doubt. It was the quiet respect that follows the undeniable truth. 3 days later, the recovery capsule descended through a clear blue sky above the Pacific Ocean, its parachutes unfolding with quiet precision against the afternoon sunlight. Millions of Americans watched the live broadcast as the spacecraft settled gently onto the water exactly inside the projected recovery zone. Cheers erupted aboard the recovery ship, while divers secured the capsule, and the hatch slowly opened. Commander Sarah Mitchell stepped into the fresh ocean air first, smiling as cameras captured the relief on her face. Daniel Alvarez followed, raising one hand toward the sky before helping Hannah Reed onto the recovery platform. They were exhausted, but they were safe. Back inside Mission Control, applause filled the room for the first time all week. Some engineers embraced quietly, others simply leaned back in their chairs, finally allowing themselves to breathe. Emily Carter looked toward Elijah Brooks, expecting to see celebration on his face. Instead, he remained focused on the final telemetry report, carefully confirming that every post-flight system had completed normally. Only after the last green status indicator appeared did he gently close his laptop. Richard Collins walked slowly across the room, carrying two identification badges. One was the temporary contractor badge Elijah had worn that morning. The other displayed a permanent blue credential with a new title beneath Elijah's name. Richard stopped in front of him while the entire room fell silent once again. "There is something I need to say," Richard began. He looked around at every engineer before returning his attention to Elijah. "This morning, I allowed my assumptions to speak louder than evidence. I judged a young man by his position instead of his ability. I ignored his work before I even understood it. That mistake nearly cost 3 extraordinary people their lives, and it dishonored the values this agency claims to represent." Nobody interrupted him. Richard held up the old contractor badge for a brief moment before placing it gently into Elijah's hand. Then he offered the second badge. "If you are willing to accept it, NASA would be honored to welcome you as a flight dynamics engineer." Elijah looked quietly at the new credential without reaching for it immediately. The room waited. Finally, he smiled and accepted it with both hands. "Thank you," he said softly. "I accept this for one reason." Richard nodded. "What reason is that?" Elijah looked across the rows of engineers surrounding them. "Because somewhere there is another young person who loves science, who studies after everyone else has gone home, who wonders if there will ever be a place for them here. I want them to know the door can stay open." Emily lowered her head for a moment as tears quietly filled her eyes. Daniel Foster stepped forward with an embarrassed smile. "I owe you an apology too." Elijah looked at him kindly. Daniel continued, "I laughed before I read your report. I will never make that mistake again." One by one, other engineers quietly thanked Elijah for returning when he had every reason to stay away. He accepted every apology with the same calm humility. Later that afternoon, Commander Sarah Mitchell arrived at Johnson Space Center after completing medical evaluations. The moment she entered Mission Control, she walked directly toward Elijah. Without cameras or speeches, she simply extended her hand. "You never met us," she said, "but you still refuse to give up on us." Elijah shook her hand warmly. "I only did what any engineer should do." Sarah smiled. "No." She gently shook her head. "You did what a good human being does." As evening settled over Houston, the building slowly emptied. The giant displays that had glowed with urgency all day faded one by one until only a few soft lights remained across the room. Elijah stood alone for a moment beside the wide glass windows overlooking the campus. Beyond them, the American flag moved gently in the warm Texas breeze, while the first stars began appearing overhead. Richard quietly approached and stopped beside him. Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally, Richard broke the silence. "When I first saw you this morning, all I noticed was your badge." Elijah continued looking toward the darkening sky. "And now?" Richard answered honestly. "Now I see the engineer I should have recognized from the beginning." Elijah smiled gently without looking away from the stars. "The universe has always been the fairest place I know." Richard looked puzzled. Elijah continued, "Out there, gravity does not care about skin color. Mathematics does not care about titles. Truth does not change because people refuse to believe it." Richard slowly nodded. Neither man said another word. Outside, the evening wind moved softly through the trees as the lights inside Mission Control reflected across the glass. On one desk rested an old contractor badge beside a brand new engineering credential. They lay only a few inches apart, a quiet reminder that kindness is stronger than pride, excellence speaks louder than prejudice, and sometimes the greatest journey is not the one that reaches the stars, but the one that teaches people to finally see each other clearly.